Thank you so much. I'd like to start by saying good evening. Thanks for joining us with this panel. We're excited to get started. We want to start by thanking the candidates who are with us: Maureen Brody, Vivian Watts, and Mark Keem. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us and answer your questions. My name is Michael Pope, and I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for having me here to moderate this panel. I'm looking forward to getting into the issues that are important to voters, and we look forward to a lively and respectful debate. Now, we're going to start with Delegate Mark Keem. His opponent is not joining us this evening, so we're going to start by giving Delegate Keem an opportunity to make some comments, about 90 seconds or so. Delegate Keem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's good to see all of you. Thank you to the League of Women Voters and all of you, the co-sponsors and participants as well. It's good to see my good friend and colleague, Delegate Watts, as well as Ms. Brody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I've had a long history working with League of Women Voters, not as long as Vivian, who's always been a member, but just a few years ago, Delegate Watts and I even commemorated through a resolution the 75th anniversary of this chapter of League of Women Voters, and your statewide chapter is led by Deb Wake, one of my dear friends and constituents as well. So I appreciate what you do. The reason why we're here tonight is because in about 3 weeks, we'll have an election. And this is an election that will determine how to maintain your quality of life, how your great schools in Fairfax County will be maintained, how to make sure that our communities are safe, our environment is clean, and that overall our state is heading in the right direction. I've had the pleasure now and the honor of serving in the General Assembly for about 12 years, representing the Oakton, Tysons, Vienna, Dunloring, and Fair Oaks area. And it's been the honor of my life. As somebody who came to this country from another country, not even understanding that there's an opportunity for people like me to participate, now to be able to hold public office and to represent my neighbors has been a tremendous honor. I'd like to continue to do this because I believe that there's still so much more progress we can make to make sure that our quality of life maintains the best it can be, and that Virginia remains a great state for both workers and for businesses. So with that, I know that my opponent is not here tonight, and so I'm sorry that I can't participate in the actual debate portion and answer questions, but certainly if you have any questions at all, please contact me in my office. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about my positions. Having served for a while, my record is pretty clear, so I look forward to answering your questions and hope that you will vote on November 2nd.
Great. Thank you, Delegate Keem, for ending that right at 90 seconds. I want that to be a model for all of our candidates to speak crisply and on time. So I'm going to go over the rules real quick, and then we'll get right into the questions. All of the candidates certified to appear on the November 2nd ballot were invited to participate in the League of Women Voters panels. So we're going to have two of them tonight here for district number 39, Vivian Watts and Maureen Brody. The candidates will have 1.5 minutes to answer questions. That's 90 seconds. And so you get 90 seconds for an opening statement, 1.5 minutes to answer each question. And then actually we get 2 minutes for the closing statement. So candidates, keep that in mind. Each candidate will have an opportunity to answer the same questions. I'm going to answer each candidate is going to be able to answer the same question. We are going to pose the questions in the order that the names appear on the ballot. So Mrs. Brody will get the first question. Delegate Watts will get the second question. After the first round of questions, I'll pose the same question over and over again. Our timekeeper will provide a 30-second, 15-second, and stop alerts. We already practiced that before we began this evening. I think that's all going to go very swimmingly. The candidates and their campaigns may not record this event and are not permitted to use any pictures or videos of this forum found on the website implying an endorsement of either candidate. After the forum, candidates will be sent a list of questions that have been submitted. And the candidates might end up answering the questions and posting them to their website, and that would be great. So without further ado, let's get started. We're going to start with our first candidate, and that's Maureen Brody. The floor is yours to make an opening statement.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the time. I appreciate all the time that the people who are watching are giving to us to get better educated on what their choices are. I guess I just want to say that I've been a volunteer for about 35 years, since I was kind of a functioning adult in Fairfax County. And I'm a lifelong resident here, and I've just come to love Virginia. I truly, it's my home. I can't imagine ever leaving it. And I thought I haven't liked the direction it's gone with the declining education, more difficult transportation, a lot of conflict that I don't think needs to happen. And I thought it might be a good time to step forward and just give the voters a little bit of a choice, for creativity, for solutions. I'm deep in the community, so I'm not at an elevated position. I'm more of a ground worker. And so I have a pretty good finger on the pulse of what a lot of different communities and neighborhoods want and need, how they could be better served. And that was really enhanced through my time as the PTA president at Lee, now Lewis High School in Springfield. So I hope to bring a lot of that to Richmond, a lot of friendliness, a lot of care, and a true love for the constituents and for this Commonwealth.
Delegate Watts, the floor is yours for a 90-second opening statement.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. Like Maureen, like many of us that are active, and I'm sure most people in our audience, I too spent many years in the community, over 15 years, never thought that I would run for office because women just didn't run for office. And so it was a very interesting transition to step into the General Assembly when only 21 women had served before. But I've always done my homework, I've always worked hard, and particularly listened, which is a lesson that I learned in the development of consensus in all of my involvement as part of my activity with the League of Women Voters. So even though I've been in the minority until the last 2 years, I have been able to really work with homeowners associations on issues like sexual abuse, gang issues, solving problems by really working across the aisle and working for common experiences. It has been great to use all the background that I've had in transportation, because the hard homework with several other Northern Virginia delegates to be ready when the state was finally ready to act after more than a generation and develop the funding that we need. I look forward to meeting the challenges that COVID has particularly highlighted: nursing home staffing, mental health, and definitely school funding.
Okay, so that's all for the opening statements. We're going to get right into the questions. And I want to start with the ongoing redistricting issue. Now, the Redistricting Commission has essentially failed to come up with maps for the General Assembly. They still got time to work things out, but it seems doubtful. What do you make of this impasse? And what do you hope happens with this important task of map making for the General Assembly? Maureen Brody, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I can say that they didn't really fail to make maps. They did make some maps. There's just such a loggerhead between the two parties, such disagreement, and real animosity between the two parties that the maps that were drawn were disagreed to. I did like what I saw in principle coming out of the committee, where they basically took the entire map, erased all the boundaries, and created a new map that tried to tie communities together based on where your sports teams were, where you shopped, where your schools were, that kind of thing. And I liked what I saw. I thought it, at least for me and for some of the people in my parish, I noticed that it really did achieve those community goals. But I understand that the political impasse that we face, that's one of the things that I hope to overcome when I get to Richmond, is that animosity between the two parties. And I really do hope that we can get to a point where we look at real facts, real communities, really understanding what the people want, rather than kind of an ideological disconnect on things. So that's kind of where I am right now. And I do hope that they will iron it out for the good of the Commonwealth.
Delegate Watts, what do you make of the impasse, and what do you hope happens with this important task of map making for the General Assembly?
One of the key problems that the resolution, besides the fact that the commission started out with a Republican map and a Democratic map rather than deciding on a common map drawer, the big problem is making sure that we properly respect all of the rulings on the constitutionality of making sure that minorities are not packed and stacked in as few districts as possible, so that they don't have the representation that constitutionally they should have. 9 years of the last decade went by in court suits before the courts finally decided that, in fact, back in 2010, there had been that kind of packing of minorities, leading to a limited number. So with the final redistricting in the last year of the decade, that was resolved. That's why you see such intensity in trying to work out that particular issue. I agree. I am glad after I've had 40% new district once and then 45% new district twice. So I'm glad that they are starting fresh. I hope before it's all done and over, there's some recognition that if the voters trusted and elected folks, that you just don't automatically throw them out of office by disregarding where they live.
All right, so I want to move on to electricity regulation. So the average Virginian pays more for their electric bill than the national average. A phenomenon the Virginia Poverty Law Center says is because customers are overcharged by the monopoly electric utility. If elected, what would you do to make sure residents in the 39th district are not overcharged? Delegate Watts, we'll start with you.
This has been an ongoing battle for approximately 4 or 5 years. It started in the transition between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, where the rules that had been put down about clean energy were erased, whereas we had assumed that the clean energy requirements we would need to fund. So that was the heart of where the overcharging occurred, was preparing to deal with the requirements for clean energy. Where we are at this point is significant effort on the part of the General Assembly to shape the kind of guidance that the state corporation should be using in looking at rates, so that it's not just the immediate rate, but also looking at the long-term cost benefit analysis of whatever the plans are of the utilities in using this. And so that both whether you make investments in offshore wind, or whether you make investments in conservation, in low-income housing, all of these are important goals that the SCC needs to be considering in the setting of a fair rate. They do need to be adjusted, but the issue is how much.
And Maureen Brody, same question to you. If elected, what will you do to make sure the residents in the 39th district are not overcharged?
Well, the first thing I would do is get rid of Virginia's clean energy, that Green New Deal. It's a boondoggle. It's loaded with garbage that does not improve the ecology, that harms the economy, and that harms residents. And Delegate Watts is correct in saying that much of the rate increases that residents see has to do with regulatory intervention rather than true market dynamics. And those people, the people who make these rules, are doing so with an ideological view rather than an actual scientific view, rather than an understanding or concern for how it impacts residents. And that concerns me deeply, because many of our low-income residents, citizens, are not able to afford the kind of homes that they should, partly because of taxes, but partly because of utility costs. Our landlords are also hit not only with utility costs that they need to cover, but also other governmental policies that have been inflicted upon them that deny them due rents. So I would say that would be the first step, and then working with SCC to eliminate some of its own conflicts of interest when it comes to dealing with prospective energy suppliers is the second step.
Well, actually, piggybacking on that last answer, I want to ask about environmental issues. So how would you plan on reducing carbon emissions and pushing Virginia toward a more sustainable future? Maureen Maureen Brody, we'll start with you.
Thank you. So there's a lot of debate on the carbon issue. There's a carbon aerosol is also considered part of the things that create a barrier to ultraviolet rays coming into the Earth's atmosphere, into our geology and our whole atmosphere, our environment. So there's a debate, a scientific debate going on as to what the actual issues for climate change are. Because there's a narrative driven by a select group of people on climate change, I think there's no denying climate change is happening, but this is a live world. We live in a living planet where climate change, as has been proven from the geological and anthropological record over millennia, changes. The real issue at hand is not trying to stop climate change, but for us to deal with climate change better in terms of our economics, in terms of the impact on our business and residents. And that's where we're not working, and rather trying to manipulate something that's largely out of our control. Let me just end by saying, I'm all for stewardship of the earth. It's one of my main things. I do it every week with my own hands. I'm working on that. But I think the policies that have been pursued don't accomplish that and don't have any hope of accomplishing that.
Delegate Watts, same question to you. What would you do to eliminate carbon emissions and create a sustainable environment?
I do embrace the Clean Energy Act and all of the goals that were set in it. Climate change is real. I've always lived by the think globally, act locally, and we can piece by piece by piece make a difference. It's going to take many different aspects, many different efforts, but I do not just automatically cross off something as not doing enough. Virginia is now 5th in the nation in our production of solar power that is spreading beyond just the farmlands where it was overused, but now looking at the initiatives of reclaimed land that was in strip mining, looking at roofs in our office parks, particularly in data centers, where a good portion of their energy can be self-generated. We need to redesign the grid, however, funding these aspects so that the power that is generated, you have standby power for the reliability. All of this are investments that are highly technical. I mentioned that offshore wind, Virginia was the first to apply for permission in federal waters, 27 miles offshore, and we are in the process of putting in a major facility well beyond what any other state has done.
All right, excuse me. I want to move on to voting. Now, the issue of voting has become a kind of a central fault line in American politics. So I want to ask about the process of getting elected. What will you do, if elected, to combat voter suppression across Virginia? And what's your reaction to allegations about election security in Virginia? We're going to start with Delegate Watts.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I hope all of the viewers took a time to look at the checklist that preceded this program as far as what has been done in Virginia for a number of years to assure election integrity. We do have regular audits. The number of machines and ballots that are audited depend upon how close the race is. We do have a paper trail, essential. I was very disturbed during those years when we had only computer access and we didn't have that paper trail. The fact that we do not during election hours, polling hours, have a connection all within one system are all very important. But we also need to make sure by our hours, by no excuse absentee voting, issues like that have been passed in the last 2 years that moved Virginia from one of the lowest to almost the top 10 in the nation as far as voter access are very important. And that access needs to be, no matter what your wealth, no matter whether or not you're working, whether or not you're a student, whether or not you're 80 years old and don't have a driver's license. These are all technicalities that we have addressed to maintain the integrity, but to make sure that we have full access to voting.
And Maureen Brody, same question to you. If elected, what would you do to combat voter suppression? And what's your reaction to allegations about election security here in Virginia?
I would say the first thing is that we need to have a voter ID system, a photographic voter ID system. That is not voter suppression to insist that everyone be who they say they are, be able to show that they are who they say they are. There isn't anyone in this Commonwealth who cannot get a photographic ID. You need it for almost everything that you do. So that's number one. And if it needs to be provided as a separate kind of a thing for the voter, that's okay with me. But every legal voter should have one. Number two, what we see in terms of voter integrity, yes, I agree. I'm deeply involved in that in Fairfax County. And I'm happy to say that it's my sense that we do a very good job. But I will say that the general registrar, for example, there is funny business. The general registrar in Fairfax County unilaterally decided to violate election law by accepting absentee ballot applications without the last 4 digits of the social security number being included. So basically, you could get the information out of the phone book and have it mailed, an absentee ballot mailed to anybody. Then the second thing is Jeff McKay's ridiculous request that absentee ballot witness signatures be eliminated. These are not things that improve voter trust in the integrity of the election. I think we really have got to work to make sure that this system is transparent and true for everyone.
I want to follow up on that. Delegate Watts, what protections would you like to see for these absentee ballots? In other words, what requirements need to be in place to make sure these absentee ballots are accurate?
First of all, on absentee ballots, I don't personally have a problem with the witness signature, although I think that it is something that if there is concern that anyone can sign, then anyone can witness. So I find an awful lot of this of just piling on without any good results. Our biggest integrity is that when you cast that absentee ballot, it is recorded by your voter registration number, a 9-digit number that is unique. Your name is not necessarily unique. Your name for your ID is not necessarily the same that you have on the voting rolls, which is why I, several years ago, was able to make a change that it be substantially similar, which is exactly the standard we have for voting corporate stock. So that if there's a hyphen or not a hyphen, if McDonald is spelled one way for the husband than it is for the wife, things that I have seen going door to door, it is not an excuse to try to throw somebody off the rolls. It is that unique 9-digit number that once in the absentee process, a vote is assigned to that number, it cannot be duplicated. It cannot be voted again. The ballot that would be coming afterwards would be challenged. And then you go to a process where one-on-one you are able to determine whether or not there was any fraud. And we've heard 0.00005 problem with fraud.
Maureen Brody, same question to you. What would you like to see? What kind of restrictions would you like to see or requirements would you like to see happen with these absentee ballots?
Well, I definitely do think that witness signature is important. It's the double check. Somebody has to say, yeah, I saw that this, I saw this person fill this ballot out. Currently, the signature requirement can be just a scrawl. You don't have, and there's nobody actually doing signature matching in the elections office. That's a problem. So if you're going to say well, you're going to allow it and their signature is good and somebody else could, whatever. If they were doing signature matching, the signature that they have on file for the voter versus the signature that's on the absentee ballot, that might be a different thing, but they're not doing that. So that witness signature is very important, and it gives accountability to the, if there is a challenge, they can go back to the witness and interview that person. That's a felony to fraudulently witness a signature that didn't really occur. So I think those kinds of basic protections are very important. And we don't really even have any statistics on how many people can't get to the polls or can't submit an absentee ballot because they couldn't get a witness signature. There's no data behind any of this. It's just one of these make-believe kind of red herrings to say, oh, the voter suppression. There isn't any voter suppression going on. And these kind of protections really are important because we have a lack of trust in our system right now. Maybe Vivian and I agree that things are fine, but many, many people do not. Why water it down?
We're going to move on to a question about human rights. Delegate Watts, this is your question first. Should transgender students be able to use the bathroom of the gender that they identify with? How should schools handle this situation? Delegate Watts, the question is yours.
Thank you, Michael. The State Board of Education has worked hard to try to come up with basic guidelines for schools to follow in carrying this policy out. The recognition of gender diversity occurring from birth is an important recognition of the humanity of every one of the students in our schools. And not to recognize that humanity, there are any number of situations historically, as well as in today's world, where young students have had severe mental problems, suicide, etc., and not being recognized for who they are. I remember I went through the days when now we started using Ms. instead of Mrs. and it was an important recognition that there was something different than just being a Miss or a Mrs. And that you didn't need to have this label of Mrs. to be a person. Ms. would be fine. I'm saying, Mr. Pope, you can say Ms. Watts, and it really doesn't matter what the status is underneath that, allowing the dignity of the individual.
All right, well then our next question is for Ms. Brody. Should transgender students be able to use the bathroom with the gender that they identify with, and how should schools handle the situation?
I would say the first thing that we have to do is speak honestly. There are children with XX chromosomes and children with XY chromosomes. Those are two different genders, two different sexes. So there are other people who have whatever disjoint between the brain and the body who may not be able to understand that about themselves, what the brain and the body, the brain and the DNA don't match. I get that. That's a very small percentage of our population, number one. Number two, there are teen students who do take advantage of this policy to do bad things. Number three, there are ways that we can accommodate these students without having boys in the girls' locker rooms. There are very many humane and dignified ways where we can do that. But to wrap the entire culture around this dissociation between brain and DNA is not the right answer. We can humanely and with great dignity take care of these kids by providing them their own facilities or whatever creative strategies. I don't want to take up all my time in the weeds, but we can do that with great dignity and great care and great love for these students. But as you saw in Loudoun County, there was a big problem with a transgender student assaulting a girl. We don't want that to go on as a standard.
All right, we're going to move on to our next question, which is about taxes. We're going to start with Ms. Brody and then move on to Delegate Watts. Question about taxes. Would you support raising new revenue? So for Virginia to raise new revenue with things like, for example, a state capital gains tax. Maureen Brody, the floor is yours.
Well, let's start again at the basics. We have a revenue addiction in Richmond that comes from kind of careless spending, although this year we have a surplus, and the question is, how do we spend it? Not how do we redistribute this to the, how do we pay off debt? How do we give this back to the people we took it from? So no, I am not a big fan of expanding taxes at this point. I'm a big fan of running a full audit on the budget of Virginia, which hasn't been done to my knowledge in decades. And finding out where all the fraud, waste, abuse, et cetera, is, cutting back on wasteful expenditures and leaving more income for households to dispose of as they see fit, rather than having Richmond come up with clever ways to spend their money and redistribute it to people. So no, I'm not for any further taxes until we get spending under control.
Delegate Watts, same question to you. Would you support Virginia using taxes to raise new revenue with things like, for example, a state capital gains tax?
Let me focus particularly on the capital gains issue. I have introduced for a number of years, always in conjunction with the fact that Virginia has no staffing standards in our nursing homes, as almost every other state does. And the result of that is that, for example, in COVID, we had 30% of our deaths were higher in nursing homes than in nationwide. Now, how do we pay for that, given that 60% of our residents of our nursing homes are on Medicaid, and our standards on Medicaid hardly could be lower? You really cannot function if you're granted Medicaid. You can't feed yourself. You need help going to the bathroom, and we don't have the staffing to go along with that. How do we fund that? It's at least starts at approximately high $20 million. It goes up to $40 million if we come up with the staffing that is recommended to keep from health deterioration. How do we fund it? We fund it out of approximately 20 estates a year, not involving at all any farms, any closely held businesses, following exactly what the federal government does. And this nationwide touches just 20 such businesses a year. In Virginia, this translates to about 20 estates. We're basically at the multi-million-dollar level where these individuals pass on the money at current value, and the 60 to 70% of that estate that was capital gains is never touched, never taxed. It is not double taxation, huge loophole that needs to be closed.
All right, Maureen Brody mentioned the surplus. I want to ask a question about that. Delegate Watts, what should happen with that surplus?
The surplus it will be used, but it will be used first of all and foremost to make sure that our reserves are at the level that they need to be to protect our AAA bond rating, which saves us hundreds of millions of dollars a year. We were warned about 4 years ago that our reserves were too low. And so this is one of the reasons why the first call is to make sure that our reserves are what they should be to hold on to that AAA bond rating. Then we also have funding that is tied to the ongoing funding of the American Rescue Act. And so that has to be particularly targeted. It's one-time money, and we have to make sure that it is going for one-time expenditures. Then we look at issues such as K through 12 funding, which has not gotten back up to where it was after the last recession in 2008, and particularly staffing, both in mental health as well as in law enforcement, where law enforcement recruitment has been almost impossible. When we used to recruit with 2 years plus of high school, now we're looking at GEDs in the recruiting class because our salaries are not competitive primitive and have not kept up for 20 years. There are a number of issues that need to be addressed of this magnitude that have been neglected.
Maureen Brody, you mentioned the surplus earlier. What would you like to see happen with that surplus?
I agree that we need to keep our AAA bond rating. One of the threats to that is the lack of economic performance and natural tax revenue coming into Richmond's coffers. And part of that is mismanagement of public policy. We see it in every aspect, shutting down our businesses for no good reason, based on no data whatsoever for many months in 2020. But back to the original question of what would I like to see happen with that, we need to be looking at why we have a surplus, if we need to return this to the taxpayers, and if we do have underfunded things such as our state mental health hospitals, we shouldn't be talking about, oh, boo-hoo, 25 years, they've gone downhill. We have the money, let's make the fix. We waste money on a bureaucracy that's this thick, and studies and all this kind of stuff that produce absolutely nothing in terms of solutions. Let's get the money right into the system where it's needed if we're not going to give that money back to the taxpayers.
All right, our next question is about campaign finance reform. We're going to start with Maureen Brody, then go to Delegate Watts. Virginia is the Wild West. There are no campaign limits. Maureen Brody, should there be limits on campaign contributions?
I think so. I don't like the idea of corporations and special interest groups and out-of-state influencers being able to fund candidates. I like the idea of having a real grassroots operation where the people you're going to represent are the people who care enough to give you the money. If you can't get people to care enough in your district to give you enough money to run a campaign, you don't have any business being in office. This year, we were able to run, at least on my campaign, we naturally frugal people, but we learned a lot about institutional frugality. And I think that's something that all candidates should do. And I think it keeps those kind of campaign contribution caps and restrictions really keep it local and make the candidate responsive to the people they're going to be representing.
Delegate Watts, should campaign contributions have some kind of limitation to them?
Yes, definitely should. I have voted for, I have sponsored such limits, but it has to be across the board. There can't be single disarmament, if you will. It is regrettable that, in fact, this has not gone anywhere. I want to be, however, whatever we do, the strength of our system needs to be based on transparency. Real shout out to Virginia Public Access Project, VPAP, for all that they do to make sure that all that we receive, all that we are spending is online. And this is tremendously important, because whatever rule you put down as far as campaign limits, I can assure you there will be a pack that will go around it with independent spending, particularly under the Supreme Court ruling that allows that. And so that constant vigilance. And then this is, again, I couldn't agree more as far as being frugal. You know, I don't do the pens and pencils. I have a few t-shirts that I wash and recycle just for safety when it gets dark out. And other than that, making sure that I have basically, I do almost all my campaign literature myself, because I do not find all these high-paid consultants actually are in touch with the level of representation that we are charged with.
Delegate Watts, you mentioned transparency. I want to follow up with that. Would you support real-time live disclosure? So the campaign contribution comes in, it immediately goes up on VPAP. Delegate Watts?
Except that that's going to be very difficult to carry out. So a number of years ago, and I had to file 17 amended reports because of this. I had someone who had been president of the Virginia CPAs as my treasurer, and he misread how you were supposed to treat people who made more than one contribution. And so I was off by thousands of dollars and needed to make all those corrections. Ever since, I've been my own treasurer. Ever since I have gone through all of because I'm responsible for it. I'm the one who signs off on it. And I can assure you that it's extremely difficult given postal services, given I believe the Republicans have the same, where people are able to contribute online, but by the time you actually get the check in hand, it could be several weeks later. There have been several times when I was told I was received a contribution and yet I didn't. And so I'm very, very reluctant to file that I received it until I have that check in hand. And of course, the speed of the mail, et cetera. And sometimes I don't get checks for 6 weeks after what the date on the check reads it is. So I'm not sure who files real time, except that we will go into a phase where I now have to contribute, make sure that you know anything over $1,000.
Maureen Brody, same question to you. Would you support real-time electronic live campaign contribution disclosure?
Just as Delegate Watts said, my experience with this system, it's called Comet, is that it's not that easy to do, just for all the reasons she listed. You could be getting donations that you don't know about. Somebody could tell you they're making a donation, it doesn't come in, just everything that she said. But I do, so if they came up with a method where you could do a real-time thing, that'd be actually awesome for the candidates, because we would be able to report, or it would be automatically reported on our behalf. That'd be cool. But the real-time functionality is probably not going to be there, based on the difference between the online donations, the mail service, your bank, how they process things, et cetera. But I will say that I am grateful for, we do report, by the way, it's not real time, but it's every, 4, 5, 6 weeks, depending on where in the election cycle you are, we do report. But I do also want to echo Delegate Watts's kudos for VPAP, because there you can see who is getting corporate donations and who is getting out-of-state donations. And I encourage people to go there and take a look at where donations are coming from.
All right, I want to move on to healthcare and the pandemic. I want to ask about vaccine mandates. So this question is first go to Maureen Brody, then we're going to go to Delegate Watts. What is the role of the state here with these vaccine mandates? When should Virginia require vaccine mandate? Excuse me. When should Virginia mandate vaccines, and when is it inappropriate for Virginia to mandate vaccines? Maureen Brody, the question is yours.
First off, let's use best language. They're not mandating vaccines, right? They don't care which vaccine you get, they're mandating a vaccination, and it's a specific vaccination for COVID that I'm sure the questioner is asking about. Do not support vaccination mandates for COVID. First off, because the vaccines do not prevent getting COVID, do not prevent giving COVID, and have unmeasured and in many cases unreported and undocumented severe adverse consequences. They're still in the development and research phase on these vaccines, and even on the booster shots and everything. So I would say this is a highly politicized vaccine, and it's not the right time to be mandating that people get injected with a medicine that isn't fully understood. That said, I don't think I'm very much pro vaccinations. They've ended many childhood illnesses. I think that that's been very good in terms of controlling some of the most serious diseases. My mother had polio. I'm glad I got I'm glad I got polio vaccine. Never got polio. I think they're a little overboard. Just because we can stop something doesn't mean we should mandate it. HPV is a good example, that HPV vaccine, where we know good and well what causes the transmission of HPV, and it's a behavioral issue that can be solved through behavior, not necessarily vaccine.
And Delegate Watts, same question to you, which is about the role of the state. So when should Virginia mandate vaccinations, and when is it inappropriate for Virginia to mandate vaccinations?
Speaking specifically about COVID, when following the guidance of the CDC, I take this very seriously. 700,000 deaths is incredible, a number of deaths. 22,000 deaths almost every other day. It's comparable to 9/11, which was such a national tragedy. I regard us working together. I love the expression of, hey, we're a team, as was said in the NFL and in the NBA. We're a team, and we've got to have each other's back. And I'll be darned if I'm going to expose anybody to COVID if I'm an active carrier. But by the way, I'm also wearing the face mask whenever it is appropriate, because it is not 100%, but it prevents deaths. It prevents people from losing family members under some of the most isolated, tragic circumstances. And certainly, I'm sorry, I think, yes, about my daughter who's teaching middle school math, who is seeing 120 kids a day, 120 households in and out of her room every single day. The degree to which we can reduce COVID through vaccinations is absolutely critical, because of the millions of COVID viruses, there's constant mutations. And the more that we reduce the number of virus that are in the population, the more we reduce the risk of mutations that'll be even more virulent.
Delegate Watts, want to follow up on this topic of the vaccinations. Should Virginia end religious exemptions for COVID vaccinations, since all major denominations support the vaccination, support the vaccine? Delegate Watts, the floor is yours.
I have read a few law discussions of that, and it's quite interesting that actually the courts have seldom determined a religious exemption in hardly any area. Conscientious objectors are about as close as the court has come to that line, because the idea of my moral values being determined by the court and translated through the doctrine of any religion, or if I am not part of an established religion, is an area that the courts have not gone into. So the idea of religious objection really wouldn't stand legal challenge should it be made. We are much better off in focusing on any health issues that might justify an exemption.
Maureen Brody, same question to you. Should Virginia end religious exemptions for COVID vaccination, since all major denominations support vaccines?
No, because a lot of the vaccine for COVID was based on fetal cell research. And for many people, irrespective of the corruption of the leadership and hierarchy of their church organizations, are deeply opposed to murdering children and stealing their cells for research and development, for medical research and development. And we have got to respect the religious principles of people in this nation, number one. Number two, if we were really going to start talking about health exemptions on this thing, I would say we need to have a lot more research on these vaccines as to who they're appropriate for, what kind of genetic makeup is having the myocarditis and the pericarditis. So what, and having other, rashes and menstrual problems. These things are not understood. So if we're going to say, well, we throw out the religious and we focus on the health implications, yeah, okay, let's start that. Let's look at, let's start looking at what these vaccines are made of and who they are appropriate for and not appropriate for, and start making some laws based on the data.
Following up on that answer, I want to ask about abortion. So Maureen Brody, we'll start with you and then go to Delegate Watts. Until recently, Virginia had a number of restrictions for women seeking abortions. You had to get an ultrasound requirement. You had to wait 24 hours. The abortion clinic had to meet hospital construction standards. Would you bring those back?
Let me start by saying the bill that Delegate Watts co-sponsored with Kathy Tran was billed as a women's rights, women's good thing for women, women's health kind of a thing. But what it really did was reduce the proposals that she had, reduced the ability of minors to be discovered as being abused. So pedophiles could take a minor that they were abusing under the proposals of that bill, could take a teen that they were abusing and get an abortion, secure an abortion. A human trafficker could do that with very few restrictions. It also made it less expensive. It makes it less expensive because you don't have to get a second doctor's opinion. The woman doesn't have to be informed as to what she's doing. There doesn't have to be an ultrasound. All sorts of complications in that bill that hurt women, that don't help women. We don't need to kill the baby because there's a crisis pregnancy. We need to lift the woman out of the crisis situation. And those are the kind of policies that I would like to bring to Richmond, not the easy coward's way out, which is to kill the child.
So I want to go to Delegate Watts, but before we do, I want to make sure I got an answer to that. So you would bring back the restrictions on the ultrasound, the 24-hour requirement, and the hospital construction standards?
I would definitely insist that women have the ability to receive the full information on what they're doing, which includes an ultrasound so they can see the body inside of them. And I would definitely. So those are not, let me say, to couch it as a restriction is a very, very leaning sort of a way to propose it. I would say that I would open up all of these things so that women are fully informed and fully protected at all times in their medical.
Delegate Watts, before Virginia used to have these laws in place that would require the ultrasound, that would require the 24-hour waiting period, that would require the hospital construction standards. What's your thought on Virginia potentially bringing those back?
They were removed, and certainly I was part of the debates as one by one they were put into place. They were removed because they made the decision, the woman, the families, the doctors, the moral decision, a matter of criminal law, rather than allowing this reproductive choice to be the determination of the doctor and the woman. I've read a number of Supreme Court decisions that have established our body of law over the years, and I've been impressed with how much wording, how much they address the medical issues that are involved. And when I look at criminal law, and I'm looking at a real incident of a woman who is 8 months pregnant, returning from a baby shower, who's on her cell phone, drives off the road, is found by the police face down. Now I've got to get 3 doctors at midnight to decide what is the right decision for the health involved, as opposed to allowing the doctor on the scene to make the best call for both the pregnancy as well as for the woman. But ultrasound, jelly on the belly, doesn't show anything until well after 6 weeks. It is not a necessary requirement, and the 24 hours makes women who are at work have to take off work twice to be able to have the necessary procedure.
Okay, so following up on the question of abortion, we'll start with Delegate Watts and then go to Maureen Brody. There's this new law in Texas that essentially prohibits most abortions. Would you support a similar bill here in Virginia?
Let me respond to the Texas law at 6 weeks, where it talks about heartbeat, but actually it is the throbbing of two areas that will later become arteries rather than any formation of a heart. It is arbitrary to say 6 weeks, as arbitrary as I believe it is for the vast majority of people who are operating out of their own moral and religious convictions, to say, as I have dealt with for a number of years, that FDA approved birth control, not morning after pill, just the IUD and the pill and other common forms of birth control, are not an abortion. There is not a single Republican who supported this bill when it finally passed 2 years ago after 20 years of efforts. And the reason they didn't support was out of the belief, at least of some groups, whether they individually believed it or not, but they knew in a primary they would be challenged, that life begins the moment that egg and sperm meet, and that anything that keeps that from implanting is an abortion. Days later, when it normally would plant in the womb, if it hasn't self-aborted, as about 1/3 of the fertilized eggs do. This is the word conception. I believe life begins at the moment of conception. As I have been handed material after material, as I've heard witness after witness on this bill, this is the arbitrary nature of the decisions that are at stake.
And Maureen Brody, same question to you. What are your thoughts about that recently passed law in Texas that essentially prohibits abortions? And would you support a similar bill here in Virginia?
Well, I haven't read that bill, so I wouldn't want to commit myself completely to it. In theory, I can say that it's a good first step to insist that we recognize that when a person is conceived, they have the full DNA of a human being, and that qualifies them as a human being, whether they have a heart that works properly or fingers that work well, or a mind that works well. These are human beings. They deserve to have the full respect and protection of the government. If the government is not in the business of protecting its citizens, I don't know what the government's job is. But then secondarily, these are not really religious matters as much as they are human rights matters. We have seen the slippery slope. Once we have a society that's willing to take the life of a child in the womb, then we now see that we have a society willing to take the life of disabled children in the womb because people don't want the inconvenience of dealing with a disabled child. We then see that they will take the life of an elderly person because they cost too much and take too much time. It's a very slippery slope, and it's important to see the universal implications of all of our policies.
Okay, a couple questions about economics. We'll start with Maureen Brody, then go to Delegate Watts. Maureen Brody, do you support requiring private employers to offer 5 paid sick days?
Okay, again, this is one of these bogus policies. The paid sick days, paid family medical leave, all of this kind of stuff is often taken from, the funding for this is taken from the paycheck of the employee. I am a huge fan of employer benefits. I think the employer supplied health insurance, employer supplied group life insurance, employer paid leave for medical and emergency and caretaker leave are all very important. But as we well know, it's very difficult for small businesses to afford these kind of things. And I don't mean small businesses with 5 people. I mean small businesses with 20 and 30 people. It's very difficult to take productive people offline without any taxation relief from the government. So I would say, okay, we can do these kind of things. We can have these kind of policies if we have a concomitant tax relief for these employers. So if they're giving salary to people, that's for not working, then that's tax deductible from their income.
And Delegate Watts, same question to you. Do you support requiring private employers to pay 5 paid sick days a year?
Yes, I regard it as progress in the workplace, just as sure as the 8-hour day was progress in the workplace. COVID has escalated a lot of pressures in society to give them a new harsh light. And one of the things that we are seeing now is a record number of people changing jobs because they finally realize that their current working conditions are not acceptable, that their health is at risk, and there are other aspects of that workplace that are risk, and they have choices now that they didn't have before. While the number of vacancies, as I was just listening to this afternoon's news, have gone down, unemployment, so that we do have people who have changed jobs. The number of people leaving work and moving to a better workplace has definitely continued to escalate. So this in and of itself, the marketplace is driving these kind of policies so that the workers are not regarded as dispensable in the production of the product or the service, but in fact are regarded as an important component and are compensated appropriately.
All right, another question on economics. We're going to start with Delegate Watts, then go to Maureen Brody, and it's on the grocery tax. So Virginia has a sales tax on grocery of 2.5%. Would you be in favor of eliminating the grocery tax?
We have it still on groceries at 2.5%, even though it's 6% on the other products. We have gone through this repeatedly, and the reason why it stays at 2.5 on food is because 2 cents of that goes directly to K through 12 funding. It goes through returning on the basis of school age population as well as the local tax base. The other 0.5 goes to transportation to spread out the burden, particularly transportation that is heavily supporting transit. So that this is why it remains. I right now can't come up with the hundreds of millions of dollars that are involved should we remove it, but it's got to be replaced with another source of revenue. You can't just exit off the books and say that K through 12 funding doesn't matter.
Maureen Brody, same question to you. Virginia's got that sales tax, 2.5% sales tax on groceries. Would you support eliminating the grocery tax?
I know that this is not my party's line, but no, I don't think a 2.5% tax on groceries is a heinous burden. The people who are most burdened by food insecurity do have means through the government of receiving help. I participate in a food pantry. We have surplus stuff at our food pantry. We don't even get rid of all the bread that we receive. So up here, at least in 39, so I would say that's not a huge burden. How that money is spent is the better question. And I would like to see our farmlands, our agriculture better supported with better policies, and so that they can have a better sales of, like, our dairy farmers. I'll give you a good example. Our dairy farmers shouldn't be struggling. We ought to be negotiating contracts and working across states so that our dairy farmers can succeed and grow instead of struggling and closing. But no, I don't think the 2.5% tax on groceries is that big a deal.
All right, I want to ask about broadband. We're going to start with Maureen Brody, then go to Delegate Watts. So the General Assembly recently had this special session. They allocated about $700 million to expand broadband. Most of that money is going to go to these major telecoms that are going to, build the infrastructure. Only a very small part of that, about 3% of that $700 million, goes to low-income people to help them get broadband access. Do you think more money should have been spent on helping low-income people have access to broadband?
Forget the whole low income, let's divide everybody kind of talk. That's another classic government boondoggle. We have rural areas across this Commonwealth where people say, well, why don't you just telework? Why don't you do this? They can't. You cannot do telework using a satellite connection or a phone connection. And so we've been talking about this for 30 years. And I think that in the time for talk is over. We're focusing a lot on 5G before we even are getting 3G to a lot of our rural areas. I think the discussion needs to rotate from the low income kind of thing, because most of our low income people are situated in places where they now can get free Wi-Fi from Cox and from public libraries and those kinds of places. Let's take a look at our rural areas where we have pockets where they don't have any broadband.
Delegate Watts, that special session that you were therefore allocated about $700 million to expand broadband. Most of that goes to these major telecoms. Very small percentage of that money, about 3% of that, goes to help low-income people have access to broadband. Do you think that more money should have been spent in that to expand access to low-income people to have broadband?
Yes, but I'm going to rephrase. Yes, it went to telecoms to put in the broadband infrastructure that we recognize has to be statewide. One of the challenges of governing in Virginia is the great spread from Appalachia west of Detroit to the northern neck to northern Virginia, that you have such diversity in both terrain as well as income, that our public policies have to recognize the cost as a public service, certainly for education as well as economic development, of extending broadband so that people can be part of today's economy, and so that we can grow our economy statewide rather than just in the urban crescent. But as to the number of people who are unable to afford broadband, certainly representing the 39th district, I am very much aware that in the core area of the district surrounding the mixing bowl, there are a number of families with more than one child trying to access for more than one class, plus perhaps a parent who might be trying to work on broadband, that the need for broadband access assistance in these low-income households is also a very important part of dealing with COVID. And this is where the American Rescue Funds, additional funds, might be able to be directed.
All right, so I'm looking at the clock. It's 8:06. We probably should wrap this thing up somewhere around 8:15. So we're coming toward the end, not at the end yet, but I just wanted to focus everyone's attention on the clock. And so I wanted to make sure I hit on gun violence prevention. The assault weapons ban has been debated, has not passed. Delegate Watts, what's your position on banning assault weapons in Virginia?
For every campaign, I answer every possible candidate's questionnaire that comes in. Only one or two will I say, oh, that's asking me if I've stopped beating my husband, to use it in the reverse order. And so I again and again have answered questionnaires about those who are Second Amendment right advocates with the phrase, I will be guarded by law enforcement. It is extremely difficult to define assault weapons as to whether or not it is a specific manufactured weapon or the way in which that weapon can be enhanced to increase its firepower. Also the magazine size, and all of these various workarounds are why nothing has passed in the last 2 years, as we have tried to define exactly what is an appropriate ban on this kind of incredible firepower that there's just absolutely no domestic use, no excuse for having.
Maureen Brody, same question to you. What's your position on the proposed assault weapon ban in Virginia?
Let's start with the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms will not be abridged or infringed. So that's our Second Amendment. And our founding fathers, Patrick Henry especially, really understood why the citizens of this country need to have the right to be armed. Because some people abuse opioids does not mean that we ought to make opioids illegal. Because some people abuse their automobiles does not mean that we should make automobiles illegal. we have a problem with crime and mental health for reasons other than the availability of guns. And it's been shown nationwide and globally that if you take away the guns, they'll use knives. Criminals who want to assault people are going to assault people. That's all there is to this. Taking away guns from people, citizens, empowers the people who are not law abiding, who keep the guns. So you say you're going to call the police. I'm sorry, the police are not going to get there in time to prevent you from being shot. But you having a gun gives you the equal power as to your assailant. So no, I don't think that our gun control ideas have anything to do with reality.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go into our closing statement. So the last question is about eliminating qualified immunity for police officers, which was a heavily debated topic in Richmond. And Maureen Brody, the floor is yours. Should qualified immunity be eliminated for police officers?
So qualified immunity to be eliminated? No, that would be nuts. The worst, police officers despise lousy cops. Good police officers really don't want to have anything to do with lousy cops. Qualified immunity is something very important for police to have, because if they're trained well, if they're mentally stable, they are able to respond based on their training in the spur of the moment, based on everything that they see in front of them. To take away qualified immunity causes them to stutter step, causes them to second guess before they even approach a subject, and can make them much jitterier, where they don't take the right reactions and people are going to get hurt. Qualified immunity does not mean a license to abuse, and nobody thinks it should or that it does. So to eliminate qualified immunity is an error, but to pursue and prosecute police who are corrupt or reckless, that's a different story. That's a necessary thing to keep our police forces clean.
Delegate Watts, same question to you. Should qualified immunity be eliminated for police officers? Elise.
History of qualified immunity over approximately about a 60-year period was saying that the police officer had to clearly know that what they were doing was not constitutional, and it's led to ever tighter court rulings on that knowledge of how tightly defined the facts are of the case. So the approach that we have taken in the General Assembly is to go after that element, making it very clear in training standards, establishing firm training standards that we had not had before, making sure that any officer who has any kind of a record, that record moves should he be hired by another law enforcement agency so that it can't be hidden. Also, I mentioned in the start that we have gone from law enforcement recruitment being able to have post-high school to having such low salaries that it's only a GED. We have also specifically defined extremely narrow circumstances of ever using a chokehold or no-knock warrants. These are all ways in which the abuses of the qualified immunity have been brought into check.
All right, we're going to now move into closing statements. I want to alert the timekeeper. There's a little bit of a time difference here. It's not 90 seconds, it's 2 minutes the candidates are given for their closing. So keep that in mind. And we are going to start with Delegate Watts. She gets the first 2-minute closing statement, and then Maureen Brody. So Delegate Watts, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm going to start with a great thank you. I hope that the audience has stayed with this, and I hope you have gotten a feel for the complexity of establishing public policy, the balance between the human experience and the factual base that we must operate on in our setting of rational policy. I thank Maureen for putting herself forward as a candidate and being here tonight so that we can have this kind of a dialogue. It has been very frustrating to me to go from what used to be the kind of coverage that I know you've been associated with, Michael, where you had more than a bumper sticker look or a tweet at something, but that you really began to look at that kind of complexity. I enjoy the challenge. I absolutely recognize my heritage. They certainly don't support me. Well, I mean, this is totally independent, but I learned when I never thought I would be in office the value of developing consensus, so that you're looking for how this affects each and every individual. And only if you develop consensus do you have a solution that works and that will in fact be embraced by the populace. It is a continuing challenge as both our economy changes, our climate changes, our population changes, and staying in touch is incredibly important. I feel my background is valuable if I stay in touch. And I promise that I will continue to go wherever I'm asked and engage and listen and try to work towards truly the common good.
And Maureen Brody, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you again for having me. I'm a nobody, so to come up in front of Delegate Watts and go tete-a-tete on these issues is a great honor. I do want to emphasize that I'm not just somebody who came out of the woodwork. I have been paying attention for decades. I worked in a bureaucracy of the Defense Intelligence Agency and saw what it was like to have good ideas suppressed and popular ideas from the upper echelon pushed forward without any kind of vision as to what was going to happen at the fallout. And I see a lot of those similarities, into what's going on in policymaking and legislation in Richmond right now. Everything from barring police from stopping cars that make a lot of noise, to making mandates, closing businesses, et cetera, without any health data whatsoever to back it up. We can do better in Richmond. And we can build consensus based on facts and honesty and eliminate the name calling. We can go in with a basic trust that we're all trying to do the right thing and then work based on facts, eliminate the animosity, the animus that's there, and work across committees, across bureaucracies, across the entire Commonwealth to make sure that everybody in this Commonwealth is well represented, and that the legislation and that the policies that we enact don't have unintended fallout that we didn't think of. So I do hope that people will take a fresh look at what's going on and a fresh look at the creativity and abilities that I could bring. So thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of our forum this evening. I'd like to thank the audience for sticking with us. I'd love to thank the candidates for a broad-based discussion. That was great. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters for inviting me to moderate the panel. And the League of Women Voters wants to remind you that many election laws have changed this year. So they want to invite you to check out all of the new voter registration and election information at their website, vote411.org. Thanks for being here. Voting has already begun, so you can go ahead and vote all the way up from now, all the way up till Election Day. And so this brings us to the end of the forum this evening. So have a wonderful evening.